talking about everything he's supposed to be talking, he's ever going to talk about, and we just have to sort things out. That's the next thing. Finally, I hear from Liz, the camp, that there's a lot of concern and interest in the part about truth, which I went over very fast, because it's something that the people who did Being in Time are familiar with, but the people who haven't aren't. So I'm going to say more about truth. But since the next thing we're going to read is half the first half is about truth and the Greek view of aletheia. It's not, if you don't get it today when I go over it, don't worry, we're going to go over it one more time. I don't remember what he says about it in here. I haven't reread this for about 2 years, but I'm going to read it over the weekend and we'll find out. This book is sort of an experiment. It's newly out. I've never taught it before. It seems to fit exactly in here chronologically, and that is, he wrote it shortly after the origin of the work of art, and it deals with the question of aletheia and what's special about the Greeks and how they began the history of the West. So it ought to be, perhaps just, let's hope, perfect for us. I want you to read basic questions. To page 108 for next time. And nobody's having trouble finding this, I hope. Okay. Now, finally, back to where we were. There's lots more to be said about this very interesting and obscure business of the struggle between earth and world, which Heidegger never talks about after this, in that way. But there's always got some kind of function that does the job of world and something that does the job of earth, even though he doesn't use that language. So it's important to get it straight. Okay. I'm going to do it in the order he does it, which means first I'm going to talk about the struggle between earth and world specifically in the work of art. And then he says we can only understand why there's this struggle if we look at the nature of truth. So then you get a bigger struggle, which is the struggle that creates a clearing at all. And we'll get to truth. I haven't misled you when I said I'm going to talk about truth today, but I'm not going to talk about truth first. So we're on page 55. At least that's where I am going to start. And it's going to be all about this question of how the struggle between our art, how artworks set up a struggle. And they set up a struggle by their very material. There's lots of ways that there's a primal conflict, he's saying at the bottom of 55, between the clearing and the concealing. And we're going to go back to that when we get to truth. But one of the ways in which truth happens is the work being of the work. Setting up a world and setting forth the earth, the work is the fighting of the battle in which the unconcealedness of beings as a whole, or truth, is won. Now, what does that mean? Well, I mean, it's not all that clear what it means, but I'll give you a whole story about what it means. It seems to be, in artworks, that the fact that they're made out of stuff is what makes the struggle between earth and world. Remember, I said it in terms of poetry, that the poetry is made out of words and the sounds of words, and that the sound is very essential, and if you try to paraphrase the poem, you won't get the whole meaning of the poem. The meaning of the poem is intrinsically involved in two things you can't paraphrase. One, the sounds of the words, and two, that the poet has chosen le mot juste. I mean, not any old word. You can't go around with a dictionary and put in what the thesaurus says is what do you call it?
Synonym.
A synonym for the words and still have what the poem's doing. So the fact that it's got this earth element that can't be made clear, can't be paraphrased, as I called it last time in Kuhn terms, can't be rationalized, is necessary to preserve the meaning of the poem. And now he goes on and he generalizes that to anything that anything is made out of So he talks about on 46 that in equipment, the material doesn't matter, he says. Those who know being in time know the whole story about how when you're hammering with a hammer, if it's all going well, the hammer becomes just transparent to you, and the more it disappears, the better the hammering. But by contrast, I'm about 10 lines down, the temple work in setting up a world doesn't cause the material to disappear, but rather causes it to come forth for the first time and to come into the open of the world's work. The rock comes to bear, tones sing, words speak, and so forth. It's interesting, by the way, I set it up so that we could figure out. I'm always surprised that he isn't talking about the sound of the words here. But he talks about how somehow it's the naming power of the word which is the material side of it. That's odd. The only thing I can say is that's because of this mot juste business, finding the right word. I mean, it's the non-synonym part of the word that he must be thinking about there. Now, what happens then? Well, what happens is that there's a struggle between the getting clear and the material, it seems, on 47 he talks about that. The earth, I'm talking about the middle of the page now, the earth appears openly cleared as itself, only when it's perceived and preserved as that which is by nature undisclosable, that which shrinks from every disclosure and keeps itself closed up. And at the end of that paragraph he says, to set forth the earth means to bring it into the open as self-secluded. And now I'm going to try to give you some examples again, try to give you some feel for what he could mean by that. One more general thing, at the bottom of 48, he says, what relations does the setting up of the world and the setting forth of the earth exhibit in the work itself? And then he says that the earth, well, I'll just read it. This is just kind of review. The world is the self-disclosing openness of the paths of the simple and essential decisions in the destiny of the historical people. Remember, I kept saying that you want to get clear the work of art, or even like the Constitution to remind you, it's got in it the meaningful differences. It's got in it what is worthy and not worthy, what's just and unjust, and so forth. And for the historical people, their job is constantly to try to get that clear. And now we're going to talk about that in terms of the artwork. The earth is the spontaneous forthcoming of that which is self-secluded, sheltering and concealing. And they struggle together at the top of 49. The opening can't endure anything closed at the end of the top paragraph, and the earth doesn't want to be drawn completely out into the open. By the way, at this point, I want to say, I looked up the German for the next sentence. The opposing of world and earth is strife. The German word is streit. Streit, if any of you know German, just cannot mean striving. That's just complete. I don't even think it's a mistake in translation. I think it's some copy editor made a mistake, because later there's lots of talk about strife and struggling, and they get it the same word right. But anyway, it's certainly struggle. But I haven't told you yet what that would look like. Well, and now comes my job. Remember, I'll keep telling you this. Go back to the phenomenon. Try to make up what it could possibly be that Heidegger has in mind when he talks in strange ways about earth and world and so forth. Okay, it looks like, and here's my story, what is dark and hidden on the one hand, and obscure and so forth, and on the other hand, what is out in the open and bright and clear, will be different from culture to culture. And how you draw the line between them will be different from culture to culture. And the struggle between earth and world in the work of art is going to give you something like the pattern or gestalt or style of the culture. There's an amazing and far-fetched interpretation, but at least it's an interpretation. For years, I had no idea what this thing called the riss, the struggle outline is. He says that it's the gestalt and so forth. I'm going to skip to 63. But what in the world content can you give that? I'm trying. I'll show you where I am. On See, in the middle of 63, he talks about this rift. That they're going to translate that as the rift design. There's no good way to translate it. I mean, that's what it means. That's fine. The word isn't going to help much. The conflict is not a rift. Rift as a mere cleft, rift open. It's the intimacy of the two, and they bring together. And let me just read that. The rift carries the opponents into the source of their unity. It is a basic design, an outline that draws the basic features of the rise of the lighting of being. See, so that's what I think is tied up with the style of the culture. What the lighting of beings, and the open, and the clearing, and the style are all ways, remember, of describing that there is some way that ways things show up as, ways it makes sense to act, and so forth. And he's talking about that again. The rift doesn't let the opponents break apart. It brings the opposition into measure and boundary into its own outline. And specifically, he talks about it in terms of gestalt on the next page. The strife that is brought into the rift and sets it back into the earth and thus fixed in place is figure, shape, gestalt. Truth, so we talk about truth being fixed in place in figure. Now comes the attempt to find some phenomena for that. Well, the story is that I'm going to tell you, if you can do better, I'm ready to listen and drop mine. My story is that in any given culture, the way the dark and the light, the hidden and the open, struggle is going to look different, and it's going to express a certain style. So they say, for instance, that Greek temples are built to show a kind of tension in which the form seems to be struggling with the stone. And there are all kinds of interesting measurements to show that they don't use just straight lines, but the steps are curved and the pillars are bowed out and so forth. That's the reading is supposed to be, that there's this struggle going on. Well, contrast that with the Christian struggle. In cathedrals, there's the struggle between the rock of the walls, the dark rock, and the windows. And the windows gradually get bigger and bigger and win out more and more over the darkness. But what you get there is something like the darkness of matter and the light of spirituality are struggling. And that's very different than the Greek struggle. For one thing, it's perfectly clear which side you're supposed to be on, namely the side of the light. And here's a really interesting, far-fetched story. What would it be like for us? Well, for one thing, what would a work of art be for us? It's not easy to figure out what a work of art would be for us, because whatever it was, it would have to. Heidegger thinks there isn't any sort of normal thing that's a work of art for us. Sometimes I think there couldn't be a work of art for us, but I think that. I was reading a man named Albert Borgmann, who's very interesting Heideggerian, and he doesn't talk about works of art, but he goes on and on about how it's so characteristic of our way of life, of our wanting to dominate everything and put it in order and get it under control, that we impose the national highway system. And it's as if the national highway system, he says it's the biggest thing that people have ever created, except for the Great Wall of China. It's the only other thing that you can see from the moon is the United States interstate highway system. And the interstate highway system is struggling, presumably, to impose order on nature. And that's a different struggle, again, with a different gestalt and a different style. So every epoch, the story is every epoch has its own way of understanding the struggle between. You can't even say, I tried to write it out here, you can't say the struggle between light and darkness, or the struggle between order and disorder, or the struggle between form and matter, because each of those is one way of doing it. You see what I mean? I can't find general terms for this struggle, and then I thought, let's call it earth and world. We need some new general terms. Yeah?
It seems different, though, well, when we start talking about dark and disorder versus light and order, especially with the examples you've been giving, that sounds like a different set. It sounds like one of them is bad, is tending to be bad, and is to be resisted, and that's what you said about the temple, about the cathedral, and one of them is good and is to be embraced. And that's a different kind of interaction, in a way less complex one, than the earth and world one that we got
Good,
yesterday.
very good. I can take that over on my side, but only by a tricky move. That's a perfectly sensible objection. The only example that you just didn't use against me was the Greek temple, because in the Greek temple it isn't as if the rock was bad and the form was good, but that they are equal and struggling and bringing themselves out into the open, just like Heidegger said they should. Well, it's one of Heidegger's theses that we are losing our sense of earth in the West, and world is winning out. I told you you consider this a strange move, but it's supposed to be that way.
And does that mean that they become less works of art as the earth disappears?
Yes, they become less good works of art, less, how does he say it? I think they, well, that's a neat question. Here, the answer is, as holding up to the people what they're doing, of course, they're equally good works of art, because if it means that everybody should see in them what they want, well, the medievals certainly saw in them dark matter being overcome by spiritual light. But if the work of art is supposed to show how truth works when it works at its best, then they're losing track of it, because truth is always for him this kind of struggle to impose this clarity, or whatever the right word is, on something that will never be able to be clear. We're losing the feeling, and that makes sense in our culture, that there's anything mysterious, anything resistant, anything that we can't rationalize. So maybe it's all right that the works of art get more and more tilted in the direction of world. I think Heidegger does think that. Okay, that's all pretty far out. If you don't like it and don't want to think about it, you don't have to do it. But I thought I owed you some account of this weird talk about risk and another struggle on my part to find the phenomena. Yeah?
Are you saying that there should be a balance then?
Yeah, ideally they should be equal and struggle, and each one bring the other one out more fully. Liz is absolutely right.
Isn't that in the sense of striving then?
No.
No?
No, striving, you have to strive for something. I see, nice move in a way. I mean, that's how you could turn struggle into striving. But the word is strife, and strife is struggle. And striving suggests there's a goal, whereas there isn't really any goal. There's just this tension. They're there, and the more they're in tension, the better. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm not sure that striving is not a bad word for this. I mean, Heidegger in the essay talks about how there's a lot of, it's an essential motion. It's not just there's these two sides against each other. Striving captures the constant motion and struggle of the entire thing. Mm-hmm. It's not just one thing going against the other, one thing just opposed to the other. They're actually struggling.
That's right. Each one is.
I think it's none of that translation.
Okay. I see what you're both saying, and I think you're right.
And a maintenance of balance is a goal.
No, wait, one thing at a time. Now, I'm not convinced of that. Wait, let me say one thing to him. I think that he says the earth is the world is striving to surmount the earth, and the earth is striving to stay secluded, and that sets up a strife or a struggle. Now, I'll have to go back to the German and see where the striving is. But there's two different things going on. There is, each one has got a goal, or earth and world, and they're opposed goals. And that sets up this struggle, which is clearly what he's talking about. What page was I on?
47 is what all that is.
What?
47.
Okay, 47. Well, on 49, where he's talking about in the essential something, rather the opposites raise each other. I can see why. Well, I now understand. Okay, I see for the first time, thanks to you guys, why you might want to say striving. I can't believe, can you, that strive, does anybody know German, could ever mean striving? Does that make any sense to you, Forrest? I thought it was totally struggle.
It doesn't, but I can see where he might want to translate it.
I can too. I can see why you might want to call it striving.
I can just pick up from this. I want to use it also polymos for Greek.
Yeah.
And it might be a reference to Heidegger, because Heidegger distinguishes between two kinds of struggle. The bout struggle, in which the aim is to flatten out the adversary, and then coming out of a struggle means winning, and that's clearly not what he wants. But Heidegger also has this good model of a strife, in which you only strive against the adversary in order to better the game itself. The model being sport in some way.
That's what he's talking about.
Exactly.
So you have You strive in a way that preserves the struggle.
Exactly. For example, like Romans,
Okay.
who try to outdo each other, but in fact the real aim
Okay.
is the racism.
Well, we're all reaching an agreement that once you see how it works, you can even see why he translates it that way, but it's wrong as a translation. But he's onto something. It's all right to say that each is striving to surmount the other. That's the first thing, earth and world. They could be said, and that's the point she keeps making, that they are also striving to preserve, and you're sort of too, preserve each other in this, each one, not to win out over each other. And the result is a struggle. And Heidegger could talk about all of them. I got to go back and look at the German. And there's no doubt about this. I looked at this German. Those are all strife. But I'll see what. It's all strife, isn't it? And polemis means struggle. It doesn't mean striving. And he's trying to do the Greek polemos, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's strife, Bestriten, and der Schlitten. So it's all strife.
Okay.
It
Well,
uses three different words.
Okay. So, but we can see why Hofstadter put in striving, which is nice. Yeah.
I was just wondering if this was a good example of strife. But this I'm borrowing from in the colleges reading of Wallace Stevens, and what he's saying is that early Anglo-American modernist writers such as Wallace Stevens concluded that the romantic notion of mysticism, with which earlier literature invested nature, needed reconfiguration to satisfy epistemological correctness.
And I don't see it. But put it aside, because Wallace Stevens has a great sense of things singing. It seems to me it belongs later. I mean, there's a poem of him about a jug on a hill. You may know it if you're a Wallace Stevens fan. And it's just as Heideggerian as could be, but not right now. I don't think we're in the big deal business of one big world one big movement toward clarity, and one big movement toward non-clarity, struggling with each other for the whole culture. It's always, remember, he says, for a historical people, and I could find, if I had time, but I don't want to go look, sort of the whole thing. It's very important. I said last time that the work of art, or any case of truth establishing itself, is trying to set up an understanding of everything. That's why it's an understanding of being. It's the style of everything. And we'll come to the Van Gogh shoes and to talking about the jug that Heidegger does, when we're not talking about the style of everything anymore. Heidegger does finally think that that's not the right. I mean, that's not wrong. It's just there's something else interesting going on that may be more important to pay attention to. But that's up ahead. Let me go on now. Now comes the truth part. The way Heidegger does it, he says, well, to understand why there must be this struggle, which is so far, the way he explains it, just a struggle in the work between the material of the work and the, I don't know what the world. It's really, the more you try to find sort of some other way of saying it that keeps his generality, the more you fall back into earth and world. But anyway, the struggle between whatever and whatever that the work of art has, you've got to find a bigger issue. So you've got to see, if you want to understand why that occurs, then you have to turn to the nature of truth. Now, I sort of rushed through the nature of truth, as Liz pointed out rightly, and I did it because I was thinking about, well, you know, being in time, you had it, but I think it's quite right that we should go over it carefully, and we will see it more in here. And if it turns out that what I say here makes all this perfectly clear, we can go over this very fast, but we'll see. Anyway, truth, to begin with, he says, truth as correspondence is how we understand truth. And that is, we understand truth as the correspondence of a representation with a state of affairs. And remember, I said you could have a representation like the sentence, there are 70 chairs in this room, and then you can count the chairs and find out whether it corresponds. Now, Heidegger talks, and he mentions that because he knows there is that kind of truth, and he talks about it on 51, and in the third paragraph, second sentence. Truth means today, and has long meant the agreement or conformity of knowledge with facts. That's, I said, the correspondence of propositions with states of affairs. This is more general. So truth could be also, you could remember something, and your memory could be true. There'd be a correspondence between a different kind of representation, namely your memory and some past way things were. But it's always agreement, conformity, correspondence. That's how we think of truth. And that, he says, presupposes a more primordial kind of truth, which the Greeks understood and called aletheia. That's the top of 51. Truth means the nature of the true. We think this nature in recollecting the Greek word aletheia, the unconcealedness of beings. Remember I said, take aletheia apart. Lethe is the concealing part, the closed up, the forgotten, and is the negative part. Now, I think I mentioned, but I'll just say it again. At first, Heidegger thought the Greeks really used aletheia as their exclusive word for truth, and he was very impressed by that. But it turns out that's wrong. A classicist named Friedlander pointed out that even in Homer, there is already correspondence. When people say what other people said was true, they mean it corresponds, and when they say it's false, they mean it doesn't correspond to the facts. So Heidegger then says, well, the Greeks understood this in their practices and sensibilities, or they wouldn't have had such a word for truth, even though the Greeks never spelled out and understood their own deep feel for truth. In fact, that's unfortunate that they didn't, because that let Plato come along and understand truth as the correspondence of something representation to state of affairs. Yeah?
I'm just curious if Heidegger can cite, say, an example in Homer or in literature
show the
of
sensibility.
aletheia, sort of, how they work. Or does it go just to the very abstract thing of sort of...
He does try it. Remind me to look. He tries it with concealedness, where Odysseus is concealing something. But I can't remember how he does it. But he does try to show that they've got this feel. Okay, but I wish I could remember it right off, but I can't. So let me get you where we are here. So what is this aletheia? What does he think the Greeks understood? Well, what we're looking for now is what could he think would be presupposed and make possible truth as we normally understand it, namely correspondence of claims to the facts, or propositions to states of affairs, or representations to reality. It's all the same stuff. What would make that possible? And what could he have in mind? Well, it's perfectly interesting and clear. He thinks, well, if there wasn't a clearing or a world in which things could show up as something, then people couldn't make truth claims about them as and get it right or wrong about them. I'll give you an example as soon as I read a general one at the bottom, the general thing at the bottom of 51. How can fact show itself if it cannot itself stand forth out of concealedness, if it does not itself stand in the unconcealed? A proposition is true by conforming to the unconcealed, to what is true. That is, what in his sense, that is something that has, boy, is that confusing. I think it should say, by corresponding to something in what is unconcealed, namely the world. Never mind. I mean, I don't want to go into that. I'm happy to do it my way. I think he's got a lot of other notions of unconcealed too. He's got a notion about dissembling, and he's got the notion that things can hide behind other things, and we can be mistaken about them. And he wants to bring all that in too, but I don't. Let me stick to my point. I'm sorry I read that. But what I'm saying isn't wrong, and in fact it's the main point he wants to make. So, unless there's an open space in which things can show up as things, there can't be truth. And now, Heidegger claims this, and let's see if I have to read the middle paragraph. No, by the way, the middle paragraph of 51 is what I just said, that there's no reason to read it. The Greeks never explicitly thought about aletheia, but it was very concealed from them, but they understood it. Well, let me give you examples of what he should have in mind here. So, you can only say true or false things, say, about God's plan, or about His creation, or the meaning of, say, the apple as a symbol of temptation and so forth, in a world opened up with Christian practices and style, in which things show up as produced by a creator and to tell us things in the book of nature, and then you can argue about what they tell us and say true or false things about them. Yeah.
Instead of a counterexample of the impossibility of a correspondence truth.
The impossibility?
Yeah, well, like if there's no clearing for such a statement.
Well, if there's no clearing, then
there would be no clearing.
Probably it'd be like the life of animals. For dogs, for instance, they wouldn't have a clearing. Yeah.
I thought you also had last month something like example about the interior decorator and the
Yeah. Do I want to bring that in? Do I think? Okay, the whole story about the picture on the wall is crooked.
Right.
Well, let's try it. I mean, if you could, let me do mine first in terms of these worlds, which is what was on my mind this time. You could see the Christian would have their kinds of truth, and now utterly different than the truth claims in science. Now we go to a Kuhnian example. Scientific communities have practices, standards of evidence, standards of argument, and so forth. And then in that community, you can make truth claims like the electron weighs such and such, or so many milligrams, or whatever it weighs. There has to be in place all these agreed upon practices for measuring things and for repeating experiments and for checking out claims in order to make that kind of truth claim. So again, in Kuhnian language, you have to have what he calls the disciplinary matrix, which are the practices, the equipment, the general way of coping with things, before you can be in that, make true statements in that field. Foucault calls this the business of being in the truth game. And hacking, Ian Hacking, you don't need to know this, but he talks about the real thing is it's not being in the truth game, it's being in the truth-untruth game, which is right. I mean, you set up, obviously, when you set up one of these worlds and things show up as something, then there's the way you can make true and false statements about them. Let's see, I'm going to do Liz's in a second. So correspondence requires disclosing. Okay, for instance, there in Heidegger there's an example of somebody who points to a picture on the wall and says this picture is crooked. And the question is, we can picture a bunch of practices in which that's perfectly right, and it means that it's not parallel with the floor or the ceiling or both, and it's true, the picture on the wall is crooked. But you can picture for somebody else who it's a little different because they don't have a different understanding of being, but that's why I was staying away from this example. But in a kind of metaphorical sense, lives in a different world. Say an interior decorator who set it up so that everything is, or postmodern apartment, so that everything is what we would normally call crooked. But for them, the picture is just right. And that's because they're in a different world. They're in a postmodern style. And again, if it weren't for having some style, either a good old solid Cartesian style where everything ought to be parallel to everything, or a postmodern style where everything should be off from parallel, you couldn't be in the business of making simple truth claims like the picture is crooked or not. I like the example mainly because it isn't fancy claims like God's plan for us or science. It's supposed to be everyday claim that it's always only in a world opened up by a bunch of shared practices that you can make truth claims. It's a pretty simple idea, and it sounds fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But isn't there a problem with that example? Because doesn't that also presuppose, in turn, its own correspondence theory? Because doesn't the crookedness have to correspond to the style in order to be the way it is?
No, well, maybe. I got it, yes. It has to be in tune with the style or something. But correspond means something like you state that it has certain characteristics, and it either has those characteristics or it doesn't. That you can't state the characteristics of the crooked picture and state the characteristics of the style, and then say that the picture. But you're right that there's some other word you need, and Heidegger loves this notion of being attuned to or being in sync with. You've got to be attuned to the postmodern way things show up before you can make this kind of claim. And therefore, there is something like correspondence in that, namely this attuned thing. But Heidegger wouldn't mind. Heidegger would say, okay, now we got three things. We've got the style which opens up a world. We've got having to be attuned to that style, and you could get out of tune, and that would be, he even has words for this. What's it, I don't know if I can remember. The directive, a funny word. But in an essay on truth, he talks about that you have to conform to the directive, and the directive is something like, I think, the style. So there is this other thing, attuning or conforming, and then both of these would have to be in place before you could make a straight, simple claim and have it be true or false, namely, the picture is crooked. He's happy with that. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if someone were to maybe ask Heidegger, would this parallel the same statement you're making, which is, in order for myself to make a statement about a world must be there for me to make a statement about in order for it to be true or false. If someone were to say that, which to me seems like a very uninteresting statement, I'm wondering how it would relate to this.
Well, if I understand you right, I think Heidegger would repudiate this. I mean, you don't make true and false statements about a world. Let's just take the sort of I'm trying to think of some example. If you mean, you could say things like the Christians believe that it was all created by God. I suppose that's a true statement about their beliefs. But a world, a style, how do you make true statements about it?
It's not necessarily that. I mean, there's one way I read it is that basically correspondence statements or statements, propositions entail a context, and only that context can make sense of those statements. But,
only within that context can we make sense of the statements. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that makes sense. But at the same time, it feels like I'm just wondering if someone were to probe further and say that basically what you're saying is that in order for anything like a proposition to be true or false or to make sense, we must have an agreed upon context in which those statements make sense. I'm wondering how much further you could take that and how interesting that becomes. What are the implications of a thought like that? Because at the surface it seems rather uninteresting and almost intuitive and something that nobody would disagree to.
It turns out to be hugely interesting only in philosophy where people have tended to forget it. I mean, then when somebody like Searle, how many have had Searle in the background, which is similar? When Searle comes in with his notion of the background and says you can't make a literal statement at all except on a background relative to which, his example of whether a cat is on a mat, we could have done that. I mean, you can't even say the cat is on the mat in the Searle example except against some shared set of background practices. And in Wittgenstein, you get a lot about how there has to be agreement in practices before you can make any truth claims at all. And it turns out to be an incredibly strange and powerful thing to say in a philosophical tradition that seems to have thought, and did things, but they were just states of affairs. That was just one of the things that was real, and mental states or statements, another thing that was really real, and their agreement or disagreement. They didn't think there was anything else going on. And now these people, Kuhn, Wittgenstein, what did you just name? Searle, Heidegger, each in their own way, say, but there's something extremely interesting going on behind this. Okay, but
so basically, it uses the ability it uses the idea of a free-floating fact of some sort that can move or become transliterated. In other words,
yes.
It allows for the context to change, which would allow the whole correspondence.
Right. There are no free-floating facts, and there are no, and it also undermines the idea that there are literal meanings in the mind that correspond to those facts just in a vacuum. Okay, good. Let me go on. Let's see now. Okay, now things get me. That was the easy part. Now we get to the double concealing that's involved in all this. The correspondence theory requires the background practices. That doesn't seem yet like a big struggle story, but aletheia is disclosing. That means now we're going to turn to, and this isn't in Searle or Wittgenstein, I don't know about Kuhn, maybe in Kuhn, to the issue of opening up a world. I mean, it is, I mean, we said, well, the world has to be there, but that it has to be there because somehow it got done that there was a clearing. And so what does that mean? Well, then he's talking about that in very hard stuff on 54 and 55, which I'll try to explain. He talks about in that there's some kind of denial going on, and in italics, the denial in the form of a double concealment belongs to the nature of truth as unconcealment. So now he's going to try to talk about, and this is really weird and hard, and I don't understand it very well, if truth is unconcealment, as the aletheia says, if it's disclosure, then you ought to be able to say something about what it was. And it's a little like somebody over here who said, I want a counterexample of what it would be not to have a world. And I said, well, think about dogs maybe, but we didn't follow it up. Well, what would it be like not to have a clearing? And then sort of make one out of that. That's going to be the primal conflict. That's going to be the denial of the concealment. He goes on, truth in its nature is untruth. We put the matter this way to serve notice with possibly surprising trenchancy that denial in the manner of concealment belongs to unconcealment is the clearing. That is, there's got to be something there that you open up or make a unified bunch of practices make into a unified bunch of practices so that things can show up as something. And what is that? Well, he says that it's a primal conflict on 55 between the concealing sort of forces and the unconcealing that's trying to open up the clearing. Let's see, I had some quotes just to tell you where we are. I got lost for a second here. The first paragraph on 55. Truth occurs precisely as itself in the concealing denial as refusal. Truth occurs precisely as itself in that the concealing denial as refusal provides its constant source to all clearing, and yet as dissembling it meets out to all clearing the indefeasible severity of error. Well, it's all about how there's got to be something there. And there's a whole bunch of candidates for what could be there. Let me just read you one more thing, and then I'm going to talk about them. There is, at the end of that paragraph, the nature of truth is the primal conflict, that open center is in which that open center is one, within which what is stands, and so forth and so forth. Well, what is it there that you have to, that is a kind of, as he calls it later, a double refusal on 60? I'm trying to understand the double refusal, which is about 5 lines from the bottom of 60. In unconcealedness as truth, there occurs also the other on of the double refusal. Well, here are my guesses. Okay. There's something like what he calls in one place the dim confusion, which I think is one name for the non-clearing that has to be struggled against. And the dim confusion language occurs at the top of 74, a renunciation of all the dim confusion in which what is veils and withdraws itself. Now, I think there are lots of candidates for dim confusion, and I'm not sure which is the one we want. One is that at the beginning, when there was when the world had a world. Here's the picture in another book: world devolves upon nature. He's really very sensible and matter of fact. He doesn't think that there were worlds all along. There were Homo sapiens around, and they were running around in groups and hunting and gathering and so forth. At some point, their practices got organized enough to have in them at least equipment, and then they were ready for being in time, so that if anybody had been around to write it. And then they got so organized that they had a style and different worlds. Maybe that happens at the same time, but I doubt it. You know, you can have, just occurs to me, equipment without language, but then comes this big jump, supposedly, where you get very fancy equipment, and probably the style story. Anyway, the dim confusion could be the level before things got organized enough, and there was, but I don't know if there would be enough of a struggle there, so let me try again. I think the big struggle for Heidegger is the struggle against something like the banal and familiar and ordinary, which makes it very hard to see anything new. And opening up a world and keeping it open has something like not letting everything become completely banalized. He talks about that someplace. I didn't write down the page number. The struggle with the familiar and the ordinary. I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking for it. I think it's right on those last pages. If I could find it in a hurry, I will tell you. It seems like a very different struggle, obviously. I don't claim they're the same. The struggle to open a clearing in the first place, and the struggle to keep the clearing from becoming dim confusion again, where everything is so taken for granted that and I don't like that. Things still will show up as something.
I mean, it seems different. It seems like on the one hand you might have dim confusion, on the other hand you're going to have something like orderly dogma or something, meaningless.
Yeah, but it looks like then you could make food plans.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm confused about this. Yeah.
It's bottom of 74.
Okay, I'm not sure it's going to help us, but I'm happy to have it. Thank you. I'll write it in here. Because I could better get out of it, but I mean, you have to look at it. Where is it? Bottom 74.
Art is the setting forth of work.
And not only the creation of it, but equally preserving it. So the work is the actual effect. I don't see it yet.
And then there's a paragraph down, the setting into work of truth, thrust off the unfamiliar.
Well, yes, but that's
The
unfamiliar. Wait, where are you? It might be the right
middle
place.
of 75.
The middle of 75.
Up the unfamiliar.
Yeah, thrust up the unfamiliar.
And thrust down the ordinary.
Okay, thrust down the ordinary. Okay, good. That's one of the conflicts. That's another way of looking at it. I'll come back to that. I don't think about that one right now. That's what happens, just let me tell you, when you open up a new world. I see now. There's this struggle when you get a world at all out of the dim confusion. There's a struggle when the world has become completely banal and you now disclose a new world. Then you struggle against that. Now, I think there's another struggle too, but I'm not sure that it's one of his, but I'm going to throw it in here because I think it would be a real struggle. When you're tending to have one world, then you're going to struggle against all the subworlds. I was thinking of Christianity having to struggle against the witches, the astrologers, people who like friendship. Augustine had lots of bad things to say about friendship. Because if you want the mainline practices of relating to God, and then you don't want the witches' practices, and you don't want the astrologers, and friends get in the way if you love them too much, or loving God, Augustine thinks, and so forth. So another way, it seems to me, so there are going to be 3 ways, I think, at least, where you've got something that is not open and disclosed, something closed in some way, that you have to open up if you're going to have a world. There's the original dim confusion. You've got to get rid of it if you're going to have a world at all. There's the banal world that you're in that you're going to have to get rid of if you want to disclose a new world. And we'll come back to that. And there's all the sub-worlds that you're going to have to struggle against if you want to have one unified world. Yeah?
2 questions, I think. One is, if the understanding understanding becomes banalized, is it then still open to re-articulate that same understanding in a way that will sort of make it alive again? So you've got re-articulating or reconfiguring. There are
Very
both
good.
options.
How did I say? I haven't said anything about this yet. You're even using my language.
Well, you said you were going to say.
Okay. Yeah, we had a talk.
Yeah.
You're getting ahead of my story. Yeah, go ahead. That's right.
And then the other one was, do the subworlds, are those going to be count as marginal practices, or are those going to be sort of independent subworlds?
Independent, because the marginal practices you can take over in a certain way, I think. But you can't take over the witches and astrologers into Christianity the way you could. I have to think about that. You're asking things ahead of my story. Ask me again. But when I got there, yeah.
I wanted to know how your interpretation of that is, he calls double concealment, in part refusal and in part dissembling.
Okay, the dissembling one is interesting. I should have said that. There are two big forms of untruth that are not simply non-correspondence. But one of them is inside the world. Inside the world is pretty much like ordinary untruth, dissemblance. Things aren't what they seem to be. They get in the way of each other. People get sort of banal, superstitious ideas. That's all dissembling. I mean, I think that's uninteresting because it takes place within a world. And he says concealment can be refusal or merely dissembling in the middle of 54. I'm explaining the merely. Now, refusal is the interesting one for him, because that's where concealment fights with unconcealment on the level of the clearing. And that's what I've been trying to explain. Yeah?
I have two questions. One, if the subworlds are struggling, do they ever disappear? How do you ever get a unified sense of being if there's a struggle with the subworlds? And the other point
wait, let me say one thing about that. I think that Heidegger does not make the mistake of thinking that you ever get a unified understanding of being. In any of these early stages, there's always stuff that's left out that's either subworld or just marginal, isn't made into any world at all, and it's important to him. There is always some dominant style, some dominant understanding of being. But if it weren't for... If it ever got so that everything was taken into one style, he would think that was very bad. The struggle would be over. World would have triumphed over Earth. There wouldn't be any marginal practices, and not that the witches may be marginal practices, but friendship would be. There wouldn't be marginal practices. So people think of Heidegger as somehow having these totalizing picture. And he does think there is one dominant style in each epoch. But he doesn't think that the dominant style does or should win out. Though he thinks that in our epoch, more than any other, the dominant style is winning out. And that's another way of saying world is winning out over Earth, and marginal practices are being eliminated, and all kinds of things he thinks is very bad about the current situation. He's very much a pluralist up to a point. But pluralism within some central organized understanding. Yeah.
I just wanted to go on.
You want? No, go ahead. Listen.
Well, I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is right, whether we can say there is an understanding of being insofar as there is a dominant sort of way of
absolutely,
doing, and then you can't ever have a totalizing understanding of being at the cost of total stasis and.
Right. There are two things to say. That's what it is to have an understanding of being. I mean, that's so obvious to me that I haven't said it enough. If it's an understanding of being, then it's about everything that is. That's what it is. That's why you can't have a sort of understanding. If you only had the understanding to say the being of the men, let's go back to Bali, was to be aggressive, and the being of the women was to be nurturing, then you wouldn't really have an understanding of being in Bali, because there wouldn't be anything that everything had just insofar as it is. But in Christianity, everything is a creature. And in modernity, everything is either a subject or an object for a subject. Is that, you're looking worried about that?
Yeah, no, I wasn't looking.
Okay. Now, I want to skip something, which I might not come back to, since you don't know that I'm skipping it. It's not going to bother you. And go over here, because I want to talk about what the printer wouldn't let me talk about, if I can do it. And, well, maybe I should take advantage of what the printer said on second thought. I'm going to put aside what's over here and do what's over here in front of me, and then I'll get to that if I get there. Okay. I wanted to talk about a whole other thing which we haven't talked about, and that is where the next thing Heidegger really wants to ask. And let me just make sure I've done this one now. Okay. Let's talk now back about the work. He wants to know how does the work of art get created. The work of art now, back to the work, remember we took a detour. Let me make clear. We supposedly were trying to explain why there was a struggle between earth and world. And we generalized it to say wherever there's truth, there's going to be a struggle between what tries to open up the clearing and what resists the opening up of the clearing. And that's supposed to explain why there's a struggle between earth and world in the work. Now, if you happen to say at this point, I don't think that explains it, they just seem to be two different stories, you will be happy. I mean, explains is a little strange. There's a kind of parallel between those two things. That why should it follow from the fact that when you open up a clearing, you've got to struggle against a lot of dim confusion and banality and other worlds, subworlds? Why should it follow from that in the work of art there's a struggle set up between something secluding and something opening? Well, I can sort of see why he thinks so, because the work of art is opening up a world, so why not? But I just think it's amusing that I got to find it. Where he says that he's supposedly done it. He's asked this question, and now he gives you the whole story about art. Okay, but I know it's still part of this other one, and it's one of the things in the computer, but it's so much trouble to get it out of the computer.
Creation as a bringing forth?
No, here it is. It's the bottom of 55. It isn't. You're doing well, but it isn't in the text. I just want to say, he says, Earth juts at the bottom. Earth juts through the world, and world grounds itself on the earth, only so far as truth happens, as the primal conflict between clearing and concealing. See, that's the answer to the question. And he writes in the margin, in German, not an answer. That is, so he's aware that this is a quick move between the two different kinds of concealing. The struggle between earth and world is a very specific struggle that the work of art sets up when it totalizes and out of the material that it's made of and so forth. But let me go where I was going to go. One of the questions he asks all through this, and I keep skipping it, and I feel bad because I think it will help you understand something if I put it in before I go to the final thing, which is how you start a new world, which is where Liz was going. Okay, he asks the question, well, where does the work of art come from? Is the work of art created? And on 61. Or where does truth as the opening up of a world come from? It's part of the same question. He says, the bottom paragraph. Truth happens only by establishing itself in the conflict and sphere opened up by truth itself. Well, we've just been talking about that. That is, truth as disclosing. Because truth, that is disclosing, is the opposition of clearing and concealing, there belongs to it what is here to be called establishing. That is, establishing worlds, setting them up and preserving them. But truth does not exist in itself beforehand somewhere among the stars to descend among beings. See, that would be ontotheology. God had the truth and then he created the world using it. Or this is impossible for the reason alone that it is, after all, only the openness of beings that first affords the possibility of a somewhere, of a place filled by present beings. So he's asking the question, well, where does truth come from then? And specifically then he gets to the issue, well, what is the origin of the work of art, which is the setting into, which is the, remember, truth establishing itself. Sorry, oh boy, did I say that wrong. No, not terribly wrong. remember, the work of art is a special case of truth establishing itself. There are also statesmen and gods and martyrs and so forth. But so let's take the special case of truth establishing itself, namely in a work of art, and ask where does the work of art come from? Is it created by creators, by people? And then he says, and I think it's important to see how radical he is here. It's no coincidence he's taken the temple, where we don't even know who made it. He thinks that people making works of art are, at best, a kind of vehicle for what's really going on. On 56, it isn't where I think it is. Sorry about that. I see at the bottom, I guess. He says the work of art is created, but of course he's not going to go along with that. So that's a funny quote. What I really want is on 61. Let's see if that's right. Yeah, we did 61. Okay, let's try 71.
The preserver stuff?
Yeah, well, no, we're going to do the creator stuff, which is on 71. I want to get you on 71 to the place where he says in the top paragraph, and it is preservers too. The preserving of a work belongs to its createdness and so forth, but it is the work that makes the creators possible and that brings by its own nature the need of preservers. If art is the origin of the work, this means that art lets those who naturally belong together at work, the creator and the preserver, originate each in his own nature. What, however, is art? That it's the origin. I think we have to talk about that for a minute, because that's pretty strange. And let's just first give, as some people say, we want counterexamples of what he's not talking about. What he's against is obviously some kind of romantic view of the creator being a kind of genius who has new ideas and who brings them into the world. He's very much against that view. The middle of 40, he says, the work is to be released by the artist, by him, to its pure self-subsistence. It's precisely in great art, and only such art is under consideration, that the artist remains inconsequential as compared to the work, like a passageway that destroys itself in the creative process. Well, that's nice, in a way. What he wants to say is, it's just, as I called it, a vehicle. The artist is just responding to something that needs the artist to sort of uses the artist. And it's so he's against altogether a view of genius. This is on 76. This is a neat sentence. All creation, because it's a drawing up as of water from a spring. That's a German pun. Schaffen is creation. Schöpfen is drawing up. He wants to say that it isn't a schaffen, it isn't a making, a producing. It's drawing something up that's already there. And it's even more a kind of interesting pun in his head. I think he thinks that how you draw it up is to become a vacuum. I think he thinks that the more empty the artist is, the less the artist has any agenda, any sort of childhood traumas he's trying to work out, any whatever. The artist should be just the emptiest, most sensitive person to what's going on in the practices and what style change might be coming in and changing in the practices. And so he says modern subjectivism immediately misinterprets creation, taking it as the self-sovereign subject's performance of genius. That's exactly what it's not like. It's like a vacuum that sucks into it what is in the spring, in this kind of spring. Let's see if I a little further. Poetic projection comes from nothing in this respect, that it never takes its gift from the ordinary and traditional, naturally. But it never comes from nothing, in that what is projected by it is the withheld vocation of a historical people. Well, now we have to understand where does it come from? That doesn't help much, the withheld vocation of the historical people. Well, at this point I want to say that I'm going to read something in, that I'm going to give you the passages that support it. Because you want to ask the next question is, what is the artist sensitive to if he's a kind of open, receptive vacuum? Well, as I said, and I didn't say it in these words, he's sensitive, I would say, to the marginal practices, to things that go on in the culture which are not ordinary and mainline. And presumably not subworlds either, but just unimportant aspects, unnoticed aspects of what's going on, sort of anomalies, you might say, in the current world. And that is a kind of reservoir that this vacuum-like artist sucks up. On 60, he talks about it. Truth is untruth insofar as there belongs to it the reservoir of the not yet uncovered, the ununcovered in the sense of concealment. Now, that's interesting because that's another form of concealedness. It's another form of refusal. That is, there is something there that hasn't been brought out and is not going to be easily and normally brought out. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, so the artist is kind of somebody who brings these anomalies back into focus, which allows the tension to occur again?
He doesn't do, and he's going to have to wait till next time, it turns out. One, because it's in the computer, and two, because time is running out. But roughly, I'll say it, because I can come back to it again. The artist, the greatest artist, which is the one who brings in a whole new world, does it by, this is the slogan, taking these marginal, anomalous practices, adhering them, and making them central. And taking the central practices and putting them down and making them marginal. That leads to a reconfiguring in a new world. Yeah?
I was just curious if you have a few passages to where I might be able to look towards this idea of the artist that's taking up the marginal practices.
Well, I'm giving them to you as best I can. I'm going to go on.
It's in conflict with another interpretation of what the work does, that's all.
It is?
It seems to me, but it could be that I'm misreading it.
Okay, well, let me give you my list of this. The openness has got to be... I don't think... But let me find the best because to go with that. So it's a receptivity, and we're still trying to get clear about how much we can find out about what it's receptive to. I think I've done as best I can there. Let's look on 62. Okay, let me read the beginning of that paragraph. The establishing of truth in the work is the bringing forth of a being such as never was before and never come again. The bringing forth places this being in the open in such a way that what is brought forth first clears the openness and so forth. So something is brought forth. Creation is such a bringing forth. Now, as such a bringing, it is rather a receiving, incorporating of a relation to unconcealedness. Now, I put that together with on page 60, that what at the bottom, the unconcealedness is some kind of reservoir. And then I think that that's the best case I can make for the fact that there is something there all along. I'll read you one more important passage. I was going to read it next time, but I see you need to hear it now. Something has been preparing itself, so to speak, in the background. I don't know whether I can... Yes, here it is. It's about page 76 somewhere, but so much goes on page 76. I don't know if I can jump ahead to it. It says something that's been preparing itself. Anybody got that?
Paragraph that starts with stone and grounding and second.
You got it? What page?
76 does not exclude but rather includes the fact that the beginning prepares itself.
Yes, where are you?
It's middle of 76.
Boy, you are good at this. The beginning already contains its end. I found that, but I couldn't find the thing I was looking for.
Second sentence.
Yeah, okay. The beginning prepares itself for the longest time and wholly inconspicuously. You have to try to figure out how to fill that in. How are you going to fill that in? I'll tell you what I'm going to do, just because it's a crazy thing to do, but I'm going to jump ahead and give you an example, the phenomena story again. What would it look like for a reconfigurer to take up marginal practices and make them central, and central practices and make them marginal? I was going to talk about it next time with all these obscure phrases, but let's have the phenomenon first. Jesus is my favorite perfect example. This time it's a God establishing truth. That's why he is a God, because he's a reconfigurer. And but what's interesting is the following: that in the Hebrew understanding of being, and the law was crucial. I'm giving you a sort of Paulian story filtered through Heidegger. The law was crucial. What you actually did was what was important. If you look at the Ten Commandments, they tell you not to kill people, and they tell you not to commit adultery, and so forth. And these are acts that you can do, or you can fail to, or stop doing if you have any willpower. And you're not supposed to do them. And if you do them, you're guilty. And that's one story. Now Jesus comes along in the Sermon on the Mount and says something absolutely bizarre, that he commits adultery who lusts after a woman in his heart, and turns what you're guilty for not what you do, but what you desire. And now it becomes a whole question of you can't. Paul is all upset because Paul is condemned all the time because he can't help lusting after all the women that come by. It was all right under the law. He didn't commit adultery, but under this new way of understanding the situation, he's guilty. And what you need is not sort of to obey the law. What you need is to be pure. But you can't be pure by your own willpower. So now you need a Savior. And everything gets changed around. But what I think is very interesting about this example is, at some point when I was doing this, some student said, but there is one of the Ten Commandments that says you shouldn't covet your neighbor's property. And coveting is a case of desiring, not a case of doing anything. And at first I thought, oh my God, and I looked up covet in Hebrew, hoping it meant something else, but it doesn't. It means what it says. But now I see that's perfect. If of the Ten Commandments, 9 of them say there's something you shouldn't do, and one of them says there's something you shouldn't desire, that's a marginal practice. I mean, a 10% practice of a 90% law-abiding culture. And Jesus comes and takes this 10% and makes it 90%. And what happens to the law? Remember, he goes around healing on the Sabbath, and they say you can't do it, it's the Sabbath, and he says, I don't have to obey the law anymore, I fulfill the law. So the 10% get to be the main thing, what you desire. And obeying the law gets to be utterly marginal. And now what have you got? A whole new world in which people now understand themselves as desire beings. And their identity depends on what they desire, not on what they do. And things show up as temptations. And worthiness, unworthiness now becomes of a purity, impurity, saint and sinner line, and not law-abiding or not law-abiding. And Jesus has reconfigured everything. You get a last word.
So you would say that he opened up a moral space?
He opened up a space, certainly a moral space, but it's almost too big to be moral, because what it makes sense to do changes, what it is to be a person changes. I think probably when you figure it out, what it is to be a thing changes, so I'd have to work at it. And the dimensions of worthiness certainly change. So anyway, what I'm going to do next time is finish talking about the reconfiguring person and another kind of person who's an articulating person. Let me say one more thing, and then you can go. This book is very confusing, and I don't want you to be confused. Heidegger starts by talking about the temple. The temple isn't a reconfigurer. The temple focuses what's there already in the world. And then he gets to at the end, which is the hard part I've been trying to explain, he gets to reconfigurers, which don't focus what's already there in the world, but bring a new world in. I'll sort these two out, give you passages, and then we'll turn back to truth in this thing next time. Okay.